King Solomon, a ruler blessed with unparalleled wisdom, immense wealth, and vast power. But have you ever wondered why a man so favored by God ended his life in despair, regret, and spiritual ruin? Could wisdom alone guarantee a fulfilling life, or is there something deeper that even Solomon couldn't grasp? In today's video, we're diving into the extraordinary rise and tragic fall of King Solomon. From his early days as a young king achieving greatness, to his heartbreaking downfall due to temptation and misplaced desires. We'll uncover the timeless lessons from his journey that can still transform the way we live today. We're here to answer some of the biggest questions. How did a king known for his legendary wisdom fall victim to the very temptations he warned others against? How could wealth, power, and intelligence fail to protect him from spiritual collapse? And most importantly, what lessons can we learn from his mistakes to avoid making them in our own lives? If you're intrigued by the powerful stories of the past and want to explore life-changing insights from the Bible that are just as relevant today, then make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. These lessons are meant to be shared. So, let's embark on this journey together and discover the profound story behind the rise and fall of the wisest king in history, King Solomon. Let's get started. Part 1. The early life of Solomon, his birth, upbringing, and path to the throne. King Solomon's story begins long before he ascended to the throne of Israel. It is deeply rooted in the rich tapestry of his lineage and the tumultuous history of his father, King David. To understand Solomon's life, one must first explore the backdrop of Israel under David's reign, a time marked by battles, triumphs, and an unwavering quest for God's favor. David, a man after God's own heart, had secured Israel's borders, brought unity to the tribes, and established Jerusalem as the nation's capital. Amidst these achievements, however, his personal life was not without strife and scandal, which ultimately shaped the early years of Solomon's existence. Solomon was born to David and Bathsheba, a union that began under controversial circumstances. Bathsheba had been the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier in David's army. The affair between David and Bathsheba, which resulted in her pregnancy, led David to orchestrate Uriah's death on the battlefield in an attempt to cover up his transgression. The child conceived from their initial affair did not survive, and David was confronted by the prophet Nathan, who delivered God's judgment upon him for his sin, 2 Samuel 12 verses 1 to 15. However, after David sincerely repented, God showed mercy. Solomon, their second son, was born shortly after, and it is written in 2 Samuel 12 verses 24 to 25 that the Lord loved him. In fact, God even sent word through the prophet Nathan to name him Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. This divine blessing upon Solomon from the moment of his birth set him apart, signaling that he was destined for greatness. Growing up in the palace, Solomon was surrounded by the political and spiritual complexities of his father's court. Despite the challenges that plagued David's household, including ongoing conflicts with rebellious sons like Absalom, Solomon's upbringing was marked by a focus on wisdom, faith, and governance. David, well aware of his own shortcomings, took great care to impart to Solomon the lessons he had learned through his victories and failures. As Solomon matured, David's influence was evident in the young prince's character. In his final days, David summoned Solomon and gave him critical advice that would shape the future king's rule. In 1 Kings 2 verses 1 to 4, David implored Solomon to be strong, to walk in obedience to the Lord, and to keep his commandments. He emphasized that true success and favor from God would only come through unwavering faithfulness to his laws. As David's life drew to a close, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Although Solomon was not David's eldest son, he had been chosen by God to carry on David's legacy and fulfill the divine promise of establishing a lasting dynasty. However, Solomon's path to the throne was not straightforward. His elder brother, Adonijah, sought to claim the throne for himself. Taking advantage of David's frailty in his old age, Adonijah gathered supporters among the military and priesthood to declare himself king. But Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, along with the prophet Nathan, intervened to protect Solomon's right to the throne. They approached the ailing David, reminding him of his oath that Solomon would succeed him as king. David, reaffirming his commitment, swiftly ordered Solomon to be anointed as king to preempt Adonijah's attempt. The scene, as described in 1 Kings 1 verses 28 to 40, is filled with tension and urgency as Solomon is anointed at Gihon amidst the sounding of trumpets and the acclamations of the people, marking the beginning of a new era for Israel. Upon taking the throne, Solomon's reign was initially characterized by a commitment to his father's counsel. His first acts as king were decisive, solidifying his authority and eliminating potential threats to his rule. He swiftly dealt with those who had supported Adonijah's rebellion, including Joab, the commander of David's army, and Shammai, who had cursed David years before. These actions, though harsh, were seen as necessary to stabilize the kingdom and establish Solomon's rule on a foundation of loyalty and obedience to God's will. But Solomon's journey as king was only beginning. Part 2: The early reign of King Solomon, wisdom and the foundations of a golden age. Upon ascending the throne, Solomon immediately faced the immense task of solidifying his authority over a kingdom that was still grappling with the turbulence left from his father David's reign. Though King David had united the tribes of Israel and secured peace through military might, the kingdom was not without its internal challenges. Solomon, now a young king, understood that in order to succeed, he needed to establish a stable foundation for his rule, rooted in both divine guidance and practical governance. Early in his reign, Solomon demonstrated his exceptional wisdom and diplomatic skill, qualities that would define his leadership and bring about a golden age for Israel. The turning point in Solomon's early rule came in the form of a divine encounter. One night, while at Gibeon, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and presented him with an extraordinary offer. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you," 1 Kings 3 verse 5. This was a moment of incredible significance, one that would set the course of Solomon's reign. Instead of asking for personal wealth, the death of his enemies, or a long life, Solomon humbly requested an understanding heart to govern his people and the ability to discern between good and evil, 1 Kings 3 verse 9. This selfless request revealed the depth of Solomon's character and his genuine concern for the well-being of his subjects. God was deeply pleased with Solomon's choice and, as a reward, granted him not only the unparalleled wisdom he sought but also riches, honor, and the potential for a long life, contingent upon his faithfulness to God's laws, 1 Kings 3 verses 10 to 14. The wisdom bestowed upon Solomon became immediately evident in one of his earliest and most famous judgments, which involved two women who came before him, both claiming to be the mother of the same infant, 1 Kings 3 verses 16 to 28. The situation seemed impossible to resolve, as there were no witnesses or evidence to prove either woman's claim. Solomon, demonstrating his God-given discernment, proposed to divide the living child in two, giving half to each woman. The true mother, driven by her genuine love for her child, immediately renounced her claim, begging Solomon to give the baby to the other woman rather than see it killed. This act of selflessness revealed her as the true mother, and Solomon awarded her custody of the child. This judgment not only solidified Solomon's reputation for wisdom, but also instilled confidence in his people, who recognized that their king was guided by divine insight. With his wisdom firmly established, Solomon turned his attention to organizing the administration of his kingdom. Recognizing that a prosperous nation required efficient governance, he divided Israel into 12 districts, each managed by appointed officials who were responsible for supplying the royal court with provisions. This structure ensured a steady flow of resources and allowed the kingdom to thrive economically. Solomon's focus on administration was not merely about centralizing power, It was a strategic move to ensure that the nation remained united and that resources were distributed efficiently across the land. Solomon's diplomatic acumen also came to the forefront during the early years of his reign. Understanding the importance of maintaining peace with neighboring nations, Solomon forged alliances through strategic marriages. One of his most notable marriages was to the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, which strengthened Israel's political ties and secured its southern borders. While these alliances brought peace and economic benefits to Israel, they also introduced foreign influences that would later pose significant spiritual challenges. As Solomon's reign progressed, the nation of Israel experienced a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. According to 1 Kings 4 verses 20 to 21, the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. This era of peace allowed for the expansion of trade and commerce, with Solomon controlling key trade routes that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. His fleet of ships, which operated from the port of Ezion-Geber near the Red Sea, brought in goods from distant lands such as gold, silver, ivory, and exotic animals. This control over international trade routes not only enriched the kingdom, but also established Israel as a dominant economic power in the region. One of Solomon's most ambitious projects during the early years of his reign was the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, a vision that had been set forth by his father, David, but which Solomon was destined to fulfill. The temple was to be a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant and a center for worship, symbolizing God's presence among his people. Solomon spared no expense in building this magnificent structure, using the finest materials available, including cedar from Lebanon and gold from Ophir. The construction took 7 years to complete, and upon its completion, the temple stood as a testament to Israel's spiritual and architectural grandeur. The dedication of the temple was a moment of profound national significance. Solomon gathered the entire nation of Israel to witness the event, and during the ceremony, he offered a heartfelt prayer of dedication. In 1 Kings 8 verses 22 to 53, Solomon stood before the altar, lifting his hands toward heaven, acknowledging God's greatness and asking for his continued guidance and mercy. He prayed not only for Israel, but also for foreigners who would come to seek God's presence in the temple, demonstrating a vision of inclusivity and a desire for Israel to be a light to the nations. As the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the inner sanctuary of the temple, the glory of the Lord filled the house like a cloud, signifying God's approval and presence. 1 Kings 8 verses 10 to 11. This moment was a high point in Solomon's reign, symbolizing the fulfillment of God's promise to David that his son would build a house for the Lord. The temple not only became the spiritual heart of Israel, but also a symbol of the nation's unity and devotion to God. However, even as Solomon basked in the success of these early achievements, subtle cracks were beginning to form in the foundations of his kingdom. While his wisdom and diplomatic skills brought prosperity, the alliances he formed through marriages with foreign princesses began to introduce influences that would later lead him astray. Solomon's decision to marry women from nations that worshipped other gods was in direct violation of God's commandment in Deuteronomy 7 verses 3 to 4, which warned the Israelites not to intermarry with those who could turn their hearts away from the Lord. These marriages, although politically advantageous, planted the seeds of spiritual decline that would later jeopardize the stability of Solomon's kingdom. As the years went by, Solomon's heart, once fully devoted to God, began to waver. The very wisdom that had been a gift from God became overshadowed by his growing pursuit of wealth, luxury, and the approval of his foreign wives. This early period of Solomon's reign, though marked by great accomplishments, laid the groundwork for the internal conflicts that would eventually unravel his kingdom. The golden age of Israel, while glittering on the surface, concealed the brewing tensions that would soon come to light as Solomon's focus shifted from spiritual devotion to worldly indulgence. As we move into the next phase of Solomon's life, we will explore how his pursuit of power and pleasure began to overshadow his devotion to God, leading to decisions that would have far-reaching consequences for both his legacy and the future of Israel. Part 3: the Golden Age and the building of the temple, triumphs and the seeds of decline. As Solomon's reign progressed, Israel entered what would be known as its Golden Age, a time of unparalleled prosperity, peace, and influence. The kingdom, under Solomon's wise leadership, reached the height of its power and became the envy of neighboring nations. This era was marked not only by economic success and political stability, but also by the fulfillment of one of the most significant projects in Israel's history, the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. However, even amidst these triumphs, the seeds of spiritual decline and future division were quietly taking root. From the early days of his rule, Solomon had been committed to fulfilling his father David's dream of building a house for the Lord. David had long desired to construct a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, which had traveled with the Israelites since their exodus from Egypt. However, God had made it clear that it would not be David, a man of war, but his son Solomon, a king of peace, who would accomplish this task. 1 Chronicles 22 verses 7 to 10. Solomon took this divine mandate seriously and set out to build a temple that would serve as the spiritual heart of Israel. The construction of the temple was a monumental project, one that required extensive planning, resources, and manpower. Solomon spared no expense in acquiring the finest materials. He negotiated with King Hiram of Tyre for the best cedar and cypress wood from the forests of Lebanon, materials renowned for their quality and durability. 1 Kings 5 verses 6 to 10. In return, Solomon provided Hiram with vast quantities of wheat and olive oil as payment, showcasing not only his diplomatic acumen but also the wealth that Israel had amassed under his reign. Additionally, Solomon conscripted labor from among the Israelites, organizing a workforce of tens of thousands to cut stones, transport timber, and oversee the construction process. This workforce included 30,000 men sent to Lebanon in shifts, 70,000 laborious, and 80,000 stonecutters working in the hills. 1 Kings 5 verses 13 to 15. The temple's construction took 7 years to complete, and its magnificence was beyond compare. The entire structure was built with precision and artistry, adorned with gold, silver, and bronze. The inner sanctuary, known as the Holy of Holies, was overlaid with pure gold and contained the Ark of the Covenant. The temple's design was intended to reflect the glory of God, with intricate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers decorating the walls. 1 Kings 6 verses 14 to 36. The grandeur of the temple not only symbolized Israel's devotion to God, but also served as a testament to Solomon's vision and leadership. Upon completion of the temple, Solomon summoned the elders of Israel, the heads of the tribes, and the leaders of the ancestral families to Jerusalem for the dedication ceremony. 1 Kings 8 verses 1 to 2. It was a momentous occasion, with the Ark of the Covenant being brought into the newly built sanctuary amidst the sound of trumpets, the singing of choirs, and the offerings of countless sacrifices. As the Ark was placed in the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary of the temple, the glory of the Lord filled the house like a cloud, so much so that the priests could not perform their duties due to the overwhelming presence of God. 1 Kings 8 verses 10 to 11. This manifestation of divine glory confirmed God's approval of the temple and Solomon's dedication to fulfilling his will. During the dedication ceremony, Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the entire assembly of Israel, lifted his hands toward heaven, and offered a heartfelt prayer. 1 Kings 8 verses 22 to 53. In his prayer, Solomon acknowledged God's greatness, his faithfulness to the covenant with David, and his mercy toward Israel. Solomon's prayer was filled with profound humility and recognition that no earthly building, no matter how grand, could contain the fullness of God's presence. He petitioned God to hear the prayers of his people when they turned toward the temple, whether in times of sin, war, famine, or exile. Solomon also prayed for the foreigner who would come to seek the God of Israel, reflecting a vision of inclusivity and Israel's role as a light to the nations. The completion and dedication of the temple marked the zenith of Solomon's reign. It was a time of great joy and celebration for Israel, as the people saw their king fulfilling the promises made to David and bringing glory to God. The temple became the center of worship and the symbol of God's presence among his people. Its influence extended beyond the borders of Israel, attracting visitors and pilgrims from surrounding nations who came to marvel at its beauty and to learn from Solomon's wisdom. Solomon's fame and reputation for wisdom continued to spread far and wide. His court became a hub of intellectual and cultural exchange, with scholars, merchants, and rulers from distant lands seeking an audience with the king. The most famous of these visitors was the Queen of Sheba, who traveled a great distance to test Solomon's wisdom with hard questions. 1 Kings 10 verses 1 to 13. She came with a caravan laden with spices, gold, and precious stones, gifts fit for a king whose fame had reached even the distant corners of her kingdom. When the Queen of Sheba witnessed Solomon's wisdom, the splendor of his palace, the abundance of food at his table, the organization of his officials, and the offerings at the temple, she was left breathless. She acknowledged that not even half of Solomon's wisdom and wealth had been told to her, and she praised the God of Israel who had placed such a wise king on the throne. Yet, amidst the glory and splendor, there were early signs of trouble. Solomon's pursuit of wealth and grandeur, while bringing prosperity to Israel, also led him down a path that would eventually erode the spiritual integrity of his reign. The immense cost of building the temple, the royal palace, and other construction projects placed a heavy burden on the people of Israel. To sustain these ambitious endeavors, Solomon imposed taxes and conscripted labor from his subjects, a decision that would later sow seeds of discontent among the tribes. 1 Kings 9 verses 15 to 22. While the people initially supported Solomon's vision, the growing demands of the king's projects began to strain the unity of the nation. Moreover, Solomon's political alliances, particularly his marriages to foreign princesses, brought not only diplomatic advantages but also spiritual compromises. These marriages were strategic, securing peace with neighboring nations like Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Sidon. However, these alliances came at a spiritual cost, as Solomon allowed his wives to bring their gods and religious practices into Israel. As a result, foreign altars and shrines began to appear even in the land that had been dedicated to the worship of the God of Israel. 1 Kings 11 verses 1 to 4. Although Solomon himself did not immediately abandon the worship of the Lord, the influence of his foreign wives slowly began to turn his heart away from exclusive devotion to God. The very success that had defined the early years of Solomon's reign began to sow the seeds of his downfall. The wealth that flowed into Israel, the alliances that expanded its influence, and the construction projects that showcased its grandeur all came at a spiritual price. Solomon's heart, once fully devoted to the Lord, began to waver as he allowed the influence of foreign gods and the allure of worldly pleasures to take hold. While the nation flourished externally, there was an internal erosion of the spiritual foundation that had once been its strength. Part 4: The beginning of the end. Solomon's downfall and spiritual decline. As Solomon's reign continued into its later years, the once glorious king, known for his unparalleled wisdom, began to lose his way. The very gifts that God had granted him, wisdom, wealth, and power, became sources of temptation that led him down a path of spiritual compromise. The early signs of trouble, which had been mere cracks in the foundation of his rule, began to widen, ultimately resulting in a tragic decline that would overshadow the successes of his earlier years. Solomon's story serves as a cautionary tale, showing how even the wisest of men can be led astray when they lose sight of their devotion to God. Despite the divine wisdom that had once guided him, Solomon gradually allowed his heart to be turned away from the Lord. The root of this spiritual decline can be traced back to the alliances he formed through marriages with foreign women. Solomon's decision to marry numerous princesses from surrounding nations was politically motivated, intended to secure peace and strengthen Israel's position in the region. However, these marriages came at a spiritual cost. in direct violation of God's commandment in Deuteronomy 7 verses 3 to 4, which warned the Israelites against intermarrying with nations that worshipped other gods. Solomon took wives from among the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. 1 Kings 11 verses 1 to 2. The Bible records that Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and as he grew older, his foreign wives led him to worship other gods. 1 Kings 11 verses 3 to 4. The influence of these women gradually eroded Solomon's loyalty to the God of Israel. The very wisdom that had been a divine gift became clouded by his desire to please his wives, who brought with them their own religious practices and idols. Solomon allowed the construction of high places for these foreign gods, including Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11 verses 5 to 7. These high places became centers for pagan worship, where sacrifices and rituals were conducted in direct opposition to God's commandments. The presence of these altars and shrines on Israelite soil was a grievous sin, especially for a king who had once been so devoted to the Lord. The temple in Jerusalem, which Solomon had built as a testament to God's glory, now stood in stark contrast to the pagan altars scattered across the land. This spiritual compromise not only affected Solomon personally, but also had far-reaching consequences for the entire nation. The people, seeing their king's acceptance of foreign gods, began to turn away from the exclusive worship of Yahweh. The nation that had once been a beacon of God's presence among the surrounding nations was now tainted by idolatry and religious syncretism. God had appeared to Solomon twice, first at Gibeon when granting him wisdom, and later in Jerusalem after the completion of the temple. 1 Kings 9 verses 1 to 9. During these encounters, God had reiterated his covenant with Solomon, promising blessings and prosperity if Solomon remained faithful. However, God had also warned of severe consequences if Solomon or his descendants turned away to follow other gods. In 1 Kings 9 verses 6 to 7, the Lord clearly stated, "But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you and go off to serve other gods, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them." Despite these clear warnings, Solomon's heart became divided as he succumbed to the influence of his wives and their gods. As Solomon's devotion waned, the kingdom began to experience the repercussions of his spiritual unfaithfulness. The lavish projects that had once symbolized Israel's prosperity, such as the construction of the temple and his magnificent palace, now became symbols of the burdens placed upon the people. To fund his grandiose lifestyle and numerous building projects, Solomon imposed heavy taxes on his subjects and conscripted labor, which led to widespread discontent among the tribes of Israel. While the nation had once thrived under his wise leadership, the increasing demands on the people began to sow seeds of rebellion and unrest. One of the most telling signs of Solomon's decline was God's response to his disobedience. In 1 Kings 11 verses 9 to 13, it is recorded that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. God declared that, due to Solomon's unfaithfulness, the kingdom would be torn from his hands and given to one of his subordinates. However, in recognition of his promise to David, God showed mercy by delaying this judgment until after Solomon's death. The kingdom would remain united during Solomon's lifetime, but would be divided under the reign of his son. The first sign of this coming division appeared in the form of adversaries who began to rise against Solomon. Hadad the Edomite and Rezon son of Eliada, both of whom had been driven out by David, returned to seek revenge during Solomon's later years. 1 Kings 11 verses 14 to 25. More significantly, God raised up Jeroboam, a talented official in Solomon's administration, as a future adversary. 1 Kings 11 verses 26 to 40. The prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam on the road, tore a new cloak into 12 pieces, and gave Jeroboam 10 of them, symbolizing that God would tear the kingdom from Solomon's son and give 10 tribes to Jeroboam. This prophecy foreshadowed the eventual division of the United Kingdom into two separate entities, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Solomon's spiritual decline not only affected his relationship with God but also led to a growing sense of disillusionment within himself. As he approached the end of his life, Solomon's reflections took on a tone of deep regret and despair. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon in his later years, captures this sense of futility and disillusionment. In Ecclesiastes 1 verse 2, he writes, "Meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless." Despite all the wealth, power, and pleasures he had accumulated, Solomon came to realize that these pursuits were ultimately empty without a heart devoted to God. He lamented how he had denied himself nothing that his eyes desired, yet in the end, it was all a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2 verses 10 to 11. In Ecclesiastes 12 verses 13 to 14, Solomon concludes his reflections with a sobering realization. Now all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. These final words serve as a powerful testament to the lesson Solomon learned too late, that true fulfillment cannot be found in wealth, wisdom, or worldly pleasures, but in obedience to God. The end of Solomon's life was marked by a sense of deep regret, not only for the spiritual compromises he had made, but also for the consequences that his actions would have on the future of the nation he had once so brilliantly led. As he lay on his deathbed, the glory of his early reign must have seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the realization that his kingdom was on the brink of collapse. Solomon, the wisest king in Israel's history, had fallen victim to the very temptations he had once warned others against. Part 5. The Final Days of Solomon, Regret, Reflections, and the Division of the Kingdom. As Solomon's life drew to a close, the king who had once been celebrated for his wisdom and grandeur found himself surrounded by the consequences of a series of choices that had led him away from God. What began as a glorious reign filled with divine blessings ended in a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Despite all the wealth, power, and achievements that Solomon had accumulated, his later years were marked by regret, disillusionment, and spiritual decline. The price of his compromises would soon be paid not only by him, but by the entire nation of Israel. During the latter part of Solomon's reign, the burdens he placed on his people grew heavier. The extensive construction projects, most notably the Grand Temple, his luxurious palace, and other fortifications, required immense resources. To sustain his ambitious building programs and his lavish lifestyle, Solomon imposed heavy taxes and conscripted forced labor from among the Israelites. This harsh treatment began to breed discontent among the 12 tribes, especially in the northern regions, where the people felt neglected and overburdened. The once united nation that David had worked so hard to establish was now fracturing under the weight of Solomon's excesses. God had warned Solomon multiple times about the dangers of turning away from his commandments. Yet, as Solomon aged, his heart became increasingly divided due to the influence of his foreign wives who worshipped other gods. Despite the clear warning from God, "If you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them." 1 Kings 9 verses 6 to 7. Solomon continued to allow idolatry to flourish in Israel. As a result, God declared that he would tear the kingdom away from Solomon's descendants. 1 Kings 11 verses 11 to 13. In the closing years of Solomon's life, God raised up adversaries to challenge his rule, signaling the beginning of the end for his once glorious reign. The most significant of these adversaries was Jeroboam, a capable and ambitious official in Solomon's administration. Jeroboam, who was from the tribe of Ephraim, gained favor among the people due to his leadership skills and his concern for their grievances. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the road and delivered a prophecy that would change the course of Israel's history. Ahijah took a new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and gave 10 of them to Jeroboam, symbolizing that God would give him rule over 10 tribes of Israel, leaving only 1 tribe for Solomon's son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem. 1 Kings 11 verses 29 to 32. This prophecy foretold the division of the United Kingdom into 2 separate entities after Solomon's death: the northern kingdom of Israel, comprising 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which included the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. God, in his mercy, decided not to divide the kingdom during Solomon's lifetime out of respect for his covenant with David. Instead, the full consequences would be felt by Solomon's son and successor, Rehoboam. Upon Solomon's death, Rehoboam ascended the throne, but his lack of wisdom and harsh policies would soon trigger the fulfillment of Ahijah's prophecy. When the people of Israel, led by Jeroboam, approached Rehoboam asking for relief from the heavy burdens imposed by Solomon, the new king foolishly refused their plea. Instead of heeding the advice of the elder counselors to lighten the people's load, Rehoboam chose to follow the counsel of his younger advisors, responding with arrogance, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." 1 Kings 12 verse 14. This decision proved disastrous. The 10 northern tribes, already disillusioned by years of high taxes and forced labor, revolted against Rehoboam's rule. Led by Jeroboam, they declared their independence, fulfilling the prophecy that Ahijah had given years earlier. Thus, the once united kingdom was split into 2, the northern kingdom of Israel, with Samaria as its capital, and the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem remaining as its center. The northern kingdom, under Jeroboam's leadership, would go on to establish its own system of worship, further distancing itself from the traditions and laws that had united Israel under David and Solomon. The division of the kingdom was not just a political split, it was also a profound spiritual rupture. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, now under Jeroboam's rule, quickly fell into idolatry. To prevent his people from traveling to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, Jeroboam established alternative centers of worship in Bethel and Dan, where he set up golden calves, leading the people into further sin. 1 Kings 12 verses 28 to 30. This act of rebellion against God's established place of worship marked the beginning of a long period of spiritual decline for the northern kingdom, eventually leading to its downfall at the hands of the Assyrians centuries later. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah, under the rule of Rehoboam, struggled with its own internal challenges. Although Judah retained the temple in Jerusalem and the lineage of David, the nation was weakened by the loss of the northern tribes. The division left both kingdoms vulnerable to external threats, setting the stage for centuries of conflict, invasions, and exile. The legacy of Solomon's reign, once characterized by wisdom, wealth, and divine favor, had now become a story of lost potential and missed opportunities. His choices, particularly in his later years, led to the fracturing of a nation that God had once blessed abundantly. The divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah would never again achieve the same level of unity, peace, and prosperity that they had enjoyed under Solomon's early rule. The consequences of Solomon's divided heart were felt not only by his own family, but by the entire nation, which would endure the pain of division, idolatry, and eventual exile. Part 6. The lasting impact of Solomon's legacy, lessons learned and prophecies fulfilled. As we reach the final chapter of Solomon's story, it becomes clear that his life and reign left behind a legacy that would echo through the centuries, shaping the destiny of Israel and teaching profound lessons about faith, obedience, and the dangers of worldly pursuits. The consequences of Solomon's actions did not end with his death, rather, they set in motion a series of events that would change the course of Israel's history, ultimately leading to division, conflict, and exile. Yet, within the tragedy of Solomon's decline, there are timeless lessons that still speak to us today. The division of the kingdom following Solomon's death was one of the most significant turning points in the history of Israel. The once united kingdom, which had reached its zenith under Solomon's early rule, was now split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This split was not merely a political or territorial division, but also a spiritual fracture that would have profound consequences for the people of God. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, under Jeroboam's leadership, quickly fell into idolatry, setting up alternative places of worship in Bethel and Dan to prevent the people from going to Jerusalem. By doing so, Jeroboam led the northern tribes into a path of rebellion against God's covenant, one that would eventually lead to their downfall and exile at the hands of the Assyrians. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah, led by Rehoboam, struggled to maintain its identity and faithfulness to God. Although Judah retained the temple in Jerusalem and remained under the rule of David's descendants, the kingdom was weakened by internal strife, spiritual complacency, and the loss of the 10 northern tribes. This weakened state made Judah vulnerable to external threats, ultimately culminating in its conquest by the Babylonians and the subsequent exile of its people. The division that began with Solomon's disobedience would haunt the nation for generations, leading to a cycle of idolatry, repentance, and divine judgment. One of the most poignant aspects of Solomon's story is the fulfillment of God's warnings. And Prophecies. God had repeatedly warned Solomon that if he or his descendants turned away from him, the kingdom would be torn apart. 1 Kings 9 verses 6-9, 11:9-13. Despite these clear warnings, Solomon allowed his heart to be swayed by his foreign wives, leading him to build altars to pagan gods and forsake the commandments that God had given him. The division of the kingdom under Rehoboam was the direct fulfillment of God's prophecy delivered through the prophet Ahijah. The tearing of Ahijah's cloak into 12 pieces, symbolizing the split of Israel into 2 kingdoms, was a vivid illustration of the consequences of Solomon's unfaithfulness. However, amidst the tragedy of Solomon's story, there are important lessons that can still inspire and guide us today. Solomon's life is a powerful reminder of the dangers of complacency and the subtle pull of worldly desires. Despite being blessed with unparalleled wisdom and divine favor, Solomon's heart gradually turned away from God. The very wisdom that had been his greatest gift became clouded by his pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure. His story teaches us that no amount of success or knowledge can substitute for a heart fully devoted to God. As Solomon himself reflected in his later years, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13. Solomon's journey also underscores the importance of staying vigilant in our spiritual walk. It is not enough to start well, we must remain faithful to the end. Solomon began his reign with humility, devotion, and a deep desire to honor God. Yet, as the years passed, he became distracted by the allure of foreign alliances, political power, and material wealth. This shift in focus ultimately led him away from God, demonstrating that even the wisest among us can fall if we are not careful to guard our hearts. The book of Proverbs, much of which is attributed to Solomon, contains countless warnings about the dangers of pride, the pursuit of wealth, and the need for humility. It is tragic that the author of such wisdom failed to heed his own advice. Furthermore, Solomon's story highlights the consequences of compromised leadership. As a king, Solomon was not just responsible for his own spiritual life, but also for the spiritual health of the entire nation. His acceptance of idolatry and the construction of high places for foreign gods set a dangerous precedent that would lead Israel into deeper sin. Leaders, whether in families, communities, or nations, bear a significant responsibility to set an example of faithfulness. The division of the kingdom and the subsequent downfall of both Israel and Judah can be traced back to the choices Solomon made during his reign. Yet, even in the midst of failure and judgment, there is a glimmer of hope. God's promise to David remained intact despite Solomon's failings. God chose to preserve a remnant, allowing the line of David to continue through the southern kingdom of Judah. This promise would ultimately be fulfilled in the birth of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who came from the line of David to restore what had been broken. The hope of a future king who would reign in righteousness and bring true peace to God's people is a thread that runs through the entire narrative of the Bible, even amidst the darkest moments of Israel's history. As we reflect on the life of Solomon, it is clear that his story is not just about a king who fell from grace. It is a story that resonates with each of us who have ever struggled with pride, temptation, and the distractions of this world. Solomon's reflections in Ecclesiastes reveal the emptiness of a life lived apart from God. He had everything the world could offer: wealth, knowledge, pleasure, but in the end, he found it all to be meaningless without a relationship with the Creator. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? He asks in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3. The answer, as he came to realize, is nothing apart from God. In conclusion, the story of Solomon is a sobering reminder of the fleeting nature of worldly success and the enduring value of a heart devoted to God. It challenges us to consider where we place our trust and what we pursue in life. Are we seeking wisdom, wealth, or pleasure for their own sake, or are we using our gifts and resources to honor God and serve others? Solomon's final words in Ecclesiastes are a call to return to the basics of faith, fear God, and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12 verse 13. It is a call that remains relevant to this day. As we close this exploration of Solomon's life, may we take to heart the lessons learned from his triumphs and failures. Let us strive not just to start well, but to finish well, remaining faithful to the one who has called us. The story of Solomon is a testament to God's grace, mercy, and the importance of unwavering faith. Though Solomon's kingdom was divided, God's kingdom remains eternal, and His promises never fail. Let us be wise in learning from the past, so that we may build a future that is firmly rooted in God's truth and love.